Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Lochdubh did not fall so much as it drifted, a fine, soaking grey curtain that blurred the line between the peat-coloured waters of the sea loch and the heather-clad slopes of the Sutherland Hills. It was a day for staying indoors, for a roaring peat fire, and for a very long, very slow pot of coffee. PC Hamish Macbeth sat in the kitchen of the police station, his long, lanky frame folded into a wooden chair that had seen better decades. His shock of ginger hair was slightly damp, and his hazel eyes were fixed with deceptive vacancy on the steam rising from his mug. Beside him, Lugs, a dog of such indeterminate breed that he looked like a rug that had sprouted ears, let out a long whistling sigh. "I agree, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his soft Highland voice barely rising above the crackle of the stove. "It is a day for doing absolutely nothing at all. If the phone rings, we shall pretend we are recording, or perhaps we shall pretend we have emigrated to Australia." Hamish was a man whose primary ambition was to remain exactly where he was. To the hierarchy of the Strathbane police, he was a lazy backwater plodder with no drive and even less intellect. This was a reputation Hamish cultivated as carefully as a prize-winning marrow. If he appeared too competent, they would promote him. If they promoted him, they would move him to a grey concrete station in a city filled with sirens and exhaust fumes. To Hamish, that was a fate worse than death. His peace was interrupted not by the telephone, but by the aggressive roar of an engine that had no business in a village where the sheep had right of way. A sleek silver Jaguar, looking like a predatory shark out of water, splashed through a puddle and screeched to a halt outside the station. Out stepped a man who looked as though he had been curated by an expensive London tailor specifically to annoy Highlanders. He wore a crisp, quilted barber jacket that had clearly never seen a speck of real mud, polished leather brogues, and a look of profound irritation. This was Julian Vane, a Sassenach property developer who had recently purchased the old manse on the edge of the village. He hadn't been in Lochdubh a week, and already he had complained about the smell of the sheep, the lack of high-speed internet, and the fact that the local shop didn't stock organic avocado oil. Vane burst into the station without knocking, bringing the scent of expensive cologne and cold arrogance into Hamish's warm kitchen. "Macbeth," Vane barked, ignoring the private sign on the door. "I've been ringing for 20 minutes. Do you ever actually work? Or is the Scottish police force merely a subsidised retirement scheme for the vertically challenged?" Hamish looked up slowly, his expression one of mild, bovine confusion. "It is a very thick wall, Mr. Vane. The signal, you see, it wanders about in the mist. You want a cup of coffee? It's only slightly burnt." "I don't want your swill," Vane snapped. "I want to report a trespasser. Someone was on my land last night. Poaching, no doubt. One of these local layabouts. I want patrols, Macbeth. I want arrests. I pay a great deal of tax for this service." "Poaching?" Hamish asked innocently, thinking of the fresh salmon currently hidden under a damp sack in his larder. In this weather, a man would have to be very hungry or very foolish to be out on the hills last night. He was there. "I saw a light. If you won't do your job, I'll take it up with your superiors in Strathbane. I have friends in the Home Office, you know." Hamish sighed, a sound of great internal suffering. "I shall look into it, Mr. Vane. I shall walk up that way. Eventually, when the rain eases. You wouldn't want me catching a chill and being unable to fill out the paperwork now, would you?" Vane let out a sound of pure disgust and marched out, his silver car spraying mud against the station's whitewashed walls as he sped away. Hamish turned back to Lugs. A very unpleasant man, Lugs, the kind of man who makes a person wish for a quiet life. And in Lochdubh, when a man like that arrives, life usually stays quiet for only a very short time. He took a slow sip of his coffee. The peace was still there, but it felt thin, like ice at the end of a thaw. The silver Jaguar had barely vanished around the bend toward the sea road before the silence of Lochdubh reclaimed the kitchen, yet the air felt tainted by Vane's abrasive presence. Hamish sighed, reaching out to scratch lugs behind a ragged ear. He knew the type well. Men like Julian Vane treated the Highlands like a backdrop for their own importance, never realizing that the mountains didn't care about their bank balances and the locals cared even less. Hamish stood up, his tall frame uncoiling like a rusted spring, and moved to the window. The rain was thickening, turning the loch into a cauldron of churning lead. He really should go out and check the man's perimeter just to keep the peace, but the thought of the damp chill seeping into his bones made the lukewarm coffee in his mug seem like nectar. "He'll be the death of the village's temper, Lugs," Hamish muttered. "A man who looks for trouble usually finds it waiting for him with a warm welcome." He decided a walk was inevitable, if only to visit Mrs. Gillespie at the post office and see if the arrival of the Sassenach had generated any more specific grievances than avocado oil. He pulled on his heavy, salt-stained greatcoat and peaked cap, whistled for Lugs and stepped out into the drizzle. The village of Lochdubh felt huddled against the weather, the small stone cottages trailing plumes of peat smoke that stayed low to the ground. He made his way toward the old manse, which sat on a rise overlooking the water, isolated from the rest of the community by a long, winding drive and a heavy iron gate that Vane had recently seen fit to padlock. As he approached the boundary of the property, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic shush of the waves against the pebbles below. It was too quiet. Usually, the Highlands are alive with the sound of birds or the distant bleat of a sheep. But today the atmosphere felt stifled. Hamish slowed his pace. Lugs, usually keen to sniff every tuft of gorse, suddenly stopped, his hackles rising in a stiff ridge along his spine. The dog let out a low, vibrating growl that didn't sound like his usual protest against the rain. "What is it, lad?" Hamish whispered, his deceptive laziness evaporating. He followed Lug's gaze toward the manse's ornamental garden, a patch of land Vane had recently improved by ripping out the hardy native shrubs and replacing them with delicate, expensive rose bushes that were currently drowning in the mud. There, sprawled across a pile of imported white gravel, was a flash of colour that didn't belong to the grey landscape. It was a bright, primary yellow, the colour of a high-end designer foul-weather jacket. Hamish climbed the low stone wall with a grace that would have surprised his superiors in Strathbane and jogged toward the shape. It was Julian Vane. The man was lying face down in the gravel, his arms spread wide as if he were trying to hug the very earth he had so recently insulted. One of his polished brogues had come off and sat a few feet away, looking absurdly lonely. Hamish knelt beside him, checking for a pulse he already knew he wouldn't find. Vane's skin was cold, the rain already washing away the aroma of his expensive cologne, but it wasn't the fall that had killed him. Protruding from the back of Vane's neck was a small feathered object. It looked almost like a decorative ornament until Hamish leaned closer and saw the shaft of a heavy-duty salmon gaff, the kind used by local fishermen to land the very fish Vane had accused the villagers of poaching. The hook had been driven home with a singular, brutal precision. "Oh, Julian," Hamish sighed, a genuine note of sadness in his voice despite the man's arrogance. "I told you it was a bad day to be out." He looked around the garden. There were no signs of a struggle, only the deep indentations of Vane's own boots and a set of smaller, blurred prints that the rain was rapidly erasing. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The man who had come to the station to complain about trespassers had been struck down by one in his own sanctuary, killed by a tool of the trade he had been so eager to prosecute. Hamish felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach. A murder in Lochdubh meant only one thing: the arrival of the heavies from Strathbane. Within hours, the peaceful, misty silence of his village would be shattered by sirens, flashing lights, and the booming, insulting voice of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Blair would stomp through the crime scene, ruin the evidence, and likely try to pin the whole thing on the first person he saw wearing a flat cap. Hamish stood up, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above the manse. Someone could have been watching from the bracken, someone who knew exactly when Vane took his morning constitutional to admire his expensive drowning roses. The wound was professional, quick and quiet. It suggested a hunter's hand, or at least someone who knew exactly where the spine met the skull. He pulled a notebook from his pocket, though he didn't write anything yet. He simply stood there, letting the scene imprint itself on his mind. He noted the position of the body, the angle of the gaff, and the fact that Vine's expensive watch was still strapped to his wrist, its diamonds winking mockingly in the dull light. It wasn't a robbery. It was a statement. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, his voice heavy. "We have to go and make the phone call I've been dodging all morning, and may the Lord have mercy on us, because Blair certainly won't." As he walked back toward the gate, Hamish realized his day of lounging by the stove was officially over. He would have to play the fool, endure the insults, and listen to Blair call him a tuchter and a useless Highland sheepshagger, all while trying to catch a killer before Blair arrested the entire local darts team. He looked back one last time at the silver Jaguar parked near the house. It looked smaller somehow, a toy left out in the rain by a child who had suddenly been called away. The Sassenach had wanted attention, and now he was going to get it from every copper in the county. Hamish reached the station and picked up the black telephone receiver. He dialed the Strathbane headquarters, his face settling back into its mask of vacant, slow-witted compliance. When the desk sergeant answered, Hamish spoke in his thickest, most deliberate accent. "Aye, hello there. This is Macbeth in Lochdubh. I'm thinking you might want to send a car, or maybe a van. We've had a bit of an accident with a garden tool and an Englishman." He hung up and sat back, waiting for the storm to break. The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, washing the world in shades of grey. He wondered if Mrs. Gillespie had any of those ginger nuts left. He had a feeling he was going to need something sweet to deal with what was coming up the road. The peace of Lochdubh did not merely break, it was detonated. 2 hours after Hamish's call, the silence of the glen was violated by the discordant wail of sirens that sent the local sheep scrambling for the higher crags. A convoy of police vehicles, led by a mud-spattered Ford Granada, screeched into the village, fishtailing dangerously near the harbour before roaring up the incline toward the old manse. Hamish stood by the gate, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his face set in an expression of mild, bovine bewilderment that acted as a perfect shield. Luggs sat at his heel, his ears flat against his head, matching his master's look of weary resignation. The door of the lead car flew open before the engine had even died, and out stomped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He was a man who looked like an overstuffed sausage squeezed into a cheap suit, his face permanently maroon with a mixture of high blood pressure and an abiding hatred for anything north of the Highland line. Behind him trailed the usual retinue, Jimmy Anderson, who looked as if he hadn't slept since the late 70s, and MacNab, who was already shivering in the damp air. Blair didn't greet Hamish. He simply marched up and poked a thick, nicotine-stained finger into the centre of Hamish's chest. "Macbeth, you tall ginger streak of nothing," Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I knew the minute the call came through it would be your patch. Only you could manage to have a high-profile murder happen right under your oversized nose while you were busy daydreaming about salmon poaching. Move aside, man, before I have you demoted to traffic duty in the middle of a Glasgow roundabout." "Good morning to you too, sir," Hamish said, his voice soft and lilting, a sharp contrast to Blair's abrasive bark. "It's a terrible business. Mr. Vane was just in the station this morning, complaining about the very trespassers that I'm thinking might have—" I don't care what you're thinking, Macbeth. Thinking requires a brain, and you've clearly traded yours for a dream and a nap, Blair snapped, shoving past him into the garden. He stopped dead when he saw the body of Julian Vane, the yellow jacket now a garish blotch against the grey gravel. Good God, what a mess. A gaff? Who uses a gaff in a garden? It's barbaric, it's primitive. It's exactly the kind of backward peasant nonsense I expect from this god-forsaken heap of rocks. Blair stomped toward the body, his heavy boots obliterating the faint blurred footprints Hamish had been trying to preserve. Hamish winced internally but kept his face vacant. It was a practiced art, watching Blair destroy a crime scene while pretending not to notice. "Look at this," Blair shouted, gesturing wildly at the gaff protruding from Vane's neck. Clearly a crime of passion or a local feud. Vane was a developer, wasn't he? Probably tried to build a car park over some local's favourite turnip patch. Anderson, get the names of every fisherman in a 10-mile radius, and MacNab, start with the most obvious suspect, whoever owns this land's neighbouring croft. Some old man with a grudge and a rusty hook. Actually, sir, Hamish intervened gently, stepping over a trampled rosebush, Mr. Vane had a great many disagreements with the locals, but most of them were about things like the noise of the church bells or the quality of the local butter. Gaffing is a very specific way to kill a man. It takes a certain flick of the wrist and strength. It's not just a poke, it's a strike. Blair turned on him, his eyes narrowed to slits. "Are you trying to lecture me on forensics, you Highland peasant? I've forgotten more about murder than you'll ever know in that drafty police station of yours. It's a hook, Macbeth, a big bloody hook. It's not specific, it's opportunistic. The killer probably found it in a shed and panicked. Now, get out of my sight. Go find some tea to drink or a sheep to talk to. I'm taking over this investigation, and I want you nowhere near it. If I see you poking your nose into my business, I'll have your badge for breakfast. Understand?" "Perfectly, sir," Hamish said, touching the brim of his cap. "I'll just be staying out of your way then. I'll be down in the village, making sure the locals don't get under your feet while you're doing your very thorough work." "See that you do," Blair grunted, turning back to bark orders at a forensic technician who was trying to photograph the body, while Blair's shadow blocked the light. Hamish turned and walked slowly back toward the gate. He could feel Blair's eyes on his back filled with contempt. To Blair, Hamish was a failure, a man who had stayed a lowly constable because he lacked the grit for real police work. Hamish allowed himself a small private smile as he reached the road. Being underestimated was his greatest weapon. While Blair was busy shouting at innocent crofters and looking for a confession through intimidation, Hamish would do what he did best. He would listen. He knew that a man like Julian Vane didn't just have local enemies, he had a history. The way he had been killed, humiliated really, left like a landed fish on his own expensive gravel, suggested a very personal kind of spite. It wasn't just a planning permission dispute. It was about making Vane look small. As he walked down the hill toward the heart of Lochdubh, the rain began to turn into a steady, rhythmic downpour. He could see the lights of the Lochdubh Hotel twinkling through the mist. It was a place where gossip was traded like currency, and where the outsider status of Julian Vane would have been discussed in exhaustive detail over the last week. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish murmured, the dog trotting along beside him, his tail low but his eyes alert. "Blair wants us out of the way, and that is exactly where we shall go. We shall go and see who has been talking, and more importantly, who has suddenly gone very quiet. A man doesn't get a gaff in the neck without someone in this village knowing the reason why." He reached the bottom of the hill and paused by the stone bridge. The water was rising, the peat-stained flow rushing toward the sea. Somewhere in that dark water, or perhaps in a dry cottage nearby, the truth was waiting. He just had to wait for it to float to the surface. He headed toward the hotel. his mind already shifting away from Blair's noise and toward the quiet, dark undercurrents of the village he called home. He would start with a warm fire and a very large pot of tea, and let the information come to him, as it always did, through the cracks in the conversation. The roar of Blair's fury was eventually muffled by the thick stone walls of the Lochdubh hotel, though the flashing blue lights of the police cars still cast a rhythmic clinical pulse against the fogged windows of the bar. Hamish shook his coat like a wet collie, hanging it on a peg near the fireplace where a stack of peat blocks smouldered with a sweet, heavy scent. The hotel bar was unusually crowded for a Tuesday afternoon, filled with villagers who had developed a sudden, pressing need for a dram the moment the sirens had begun. There was a low hum of speculation that died down into a respectful, expectant silence as Hamish approached the counter. To the casual observer, he looked defeated, a man sent packing by his betters, but to those who knew him, the slight tilt of his head suggested he was already sifting through the air for the scent of a lie. "A bad business, Hamish," muttered Archie MacLean, the proprietor, as he polished a glass with a cloth that looked as if it had seen the better part of the 20th century. "I hear the Sassenach has met a sticky end on his own garden path. The word is it was a gaff." Hamish leaned against the polished wood of the bar, his expression one of weary sadness. "It was indeed, Archie, a terrible way to go, and on such a wet day too. It'll be a long time before the gravel is clean again. I don't suppose a man like Mr. Vane had many friends coming in here to toast his health?" Archie snorted, pouring a measure of whiskey for a waiting customer before leaning in closer. "Friends?" The man treated the staff like they were part of the plumbing. But he wasn't alone as much as he liked to pretend. There was a woman, Hamish. Not a local lass, mind you. A sharp-featured thing with a voice like a corncrake and a temper to match. She arrived on the evening bus 2 days ago and went straight to the manse. She didn't come back down. "A woman?" Hamish repeated, his interest piqued, but his face remained a mask of dull curiosity. "Mr. Vane didn't mention a guest when he came to see me this morning. He seemed more concerned about poachers." "Well, she was there," piped up Mrs. Wellington, the schoolteacher, who was sitting in the corner with a glass of sherry. "I saw them arguing by the gates yesterday evening. She was waving a piece of paper in his face, and he looked as though he'd bitten into a lemon. She wasn't a girlfriend, Hamish. There was no affection in it. It looked like business, and the nasty kind at that." Hamish nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Blair would be busy rounding up the local poachers and threatening them with the 3rd degree over a missing salmon gaff, completely ignoring the fact that a professional developer usually left a trail of disgruntled associates in his wake. Hamish moved away from the bar and took a seat by the fire, where Luggs had already claimed the rug. He wasn't there to interrogate, he was there to mooch. In Lochdubh, information was a gift given to those who didn't seem to want it. He sat quietly, nursing a small coffee and listening to the ripples of gossip. He heard about Vane's plan to fence off the old right-of-way that led to the cliffs, a move that had infuriated the local hikers, and he heard about a row at the grocery shop over the price of a pint of cream. But it was the quiet conversation between 2 gillies in the far booth that caught his ear. They were talking about the light on the hill that Vane had complained about. "It wasn't a poacher's lamp," one whispered, his voice thick with the burr of the west coast. "Too steady for that. The old shepherd's bothy on the Vane property built it. Someone's been staying there, quiet as a mouse, for nearly a week. I saw smoke from the chimney at dusk, but when I went to look, there was no one but the shadows." Hamish stared into the embers of the fire. A mystery woman at the manse and a silent squatter in the bothy. The plot was thickening like a good Highland stew, while Blair was likely still shouting at a terrified teenager for owning a fishing rod. Hamish knew he needed to see both, but he also knew that if he were spotted by Blair's men, he'd be hauled back to the station and locked in his own cell for obstructing the peace. He stood, stretching his long limbs. "I think I'll take a walk up toward the cliffs, Archie. The air might clear my head." All that shouting from the DCI has given me a bit of a migraine. Watch yourself, Hamish, Archie warned. The ground is treacherous after this much rain, and with a killer on the loose, it's not the time for a peaceful stroll. Oh, I'm just a useless plodder, Archie, Hamish said with a self-deprecating grin. Nobody bothers with the likes of me. He stepped back out into the rain, but he didn't head for the cliffs. Instead, he made a wide detour behind the village, moving through the soggy peat bogs with the sure-footedness of a man who had spent his life stalking deer. He kept low, using the natural folds of the land to hide his silhouette from the manse. As he approached the old shepherd's bothy, a crumbling stone structure tucked into a cleft of the hill, he saw that the ghillie had been right. There was no smoke now, but the smell of burnt wood lingered in the damp air. He reached the heavy wooden door and opened it. The interior was sparse, a pile of dry heather for a bed, a few empty tins of sardines, and a discarded newspaper. It was a London paper, dated 3 days ago. Hamish picked it up, his eyes scanning the pages. A small article had been circled in shaky blue ink. It was a notice about a bankruptcy hearing for a firm called Vane Urban Renewals. So, Julian, Hamish whispered to the empty room, you weren't just a rich man playing at being a squire. You were a man on the run from your own failures. Suddenly, the sound of a snapping twig echoed from the bracken outside. Lugs let out a sharp, warning bark. Hamish dropped the paper and flattened himself against the cold stone wall, his hand moving instinctively toward the heavy torch in his pocket. Someone was outside, and they weren't wearing the heavy, rhythmic boots of a Strathbane policeman. The footsteps were light, frantic, and coming closer. Hamish held his breath, the deceptive laziness of his nature replaced by the coiled tension of a predator. He waited for the door to swing wider, knowing that the mooching part of his day had just come to a very abrupt and potentially dangerous end. The door to the boat creaked open, admitting a gust of freezing rain, and a figure wrapped in a dark, expensive-looking cloak that seemed entirely impractical for the Highland terrain. Hamish remained motionless in the shadows, his heart hammering a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. The intruder stepped inside, shivering violently, and reached for a small rucksack left in the corner. As she turned, the dim light from the open door caught the sharp, aristocratic features of a woman in her mid-40s, the corncrake voice Archie had described. "It's a bit damp for a holiday, is it not?" Hamish said softly, stepping away from the wall. The woman let out a strangled yelp, dropping her bag. She stared at Hamish, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and outrage. "Who the hell are you? You nearly gave me a heart attack." "PC Hamish Macbeth," he replied, touching the brim of his damp cap with a polite, infuriatingly slow gesture. "And you would be the guest Julian Vane forgot to mention, or perhaps the one he was hiding from." The woman drew herself up, trying to regain a measure of dignity despite her shivering. "I am Sheila Vane, Julian's wife, or soon-to-be ex-wife if the solicitors ever find a way through the mess he's made of our lives. I suppose you're here to tell me the accident has been cleared up and I can finally get into the house." Hamish watched her closely. There was grief in her eyes, but it was buried under layers of resentment and a very sharp, very English pragmatism. Before he could press her further, the sound of a high-performance engine cut through the rain outside. A green Land Rover Defender pulled up to the booth, and a familiar, elegant figure stepped out. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the daughter of the local colonel, and a woman who had occupied a significant, if often frustrating, corner of Hamish's heart for years, hurried toward the door. She looked impeccable even in the drizzle, her blonde hair tucked neatly under a Barber hood. She stopped short when she saw Hamish and the bedraggled Sheila Vane. "Hamish, I thought I might find you skulking about where you weren't supposed to be," Priscilla said, her voice a mix of amusement and concern. "I saw Sheila walking toward the hills and thought she looked distressed. I didn't realize you'd already cornered her." "I haven't cornered anyone, Priscilla," Hamish said. feeling the usual awkwardness that accompanied her presence. "I was just asking Mrs. Vane about the bankruptcy notice I found. It seems Julian was in a bit of a hole." Priscilla stepped into the bothy, her presence instantly making the derelict space feel more crowded. She glanced at Sheila, then at the circled newspaper. "It's worse than a hole, Hamish. My father had dinner with Julian last week, before the mood soured, and he mentioned that Julian was trying to sell the manse back to the estate. He was desperate. He'd lost everything in a development deal in London that went south. He came here not to retire, but to hide from his creditors." Sheila Vane let out a bitter laugh. "Hide? He came here to reinvent himself as a country squire, while the rest of us were left to deal with the liquidators. He took the last of our liquid assets and bought that silver car and those ridiculous roses. He thought if he looked successful, the banks would leave him alone. But they don't, do they? They just send more letters." Hamish leaned against the stone door frame, looking out at the mist. "And the gaff, Mrs. Vane? Did Julian have any enemies who were particularly fond of fishing?" "Everyone in this miserable village is fond of fishing," Sheila snapped. "But Julian didn't know a gaff from a golf club. He'd hired someone to help him manage the estate, a local man. He said the man was authentic and would help him blend in. Personally, I thought the man looked like he wanted to drown Julian in the loch from the moment they met." "Do you have a name?" Hamish asked, his voice sharpening. "I don't know. Some Scots names. Angus, Alistair." He had a permanent scowl and smelled of old tobacco. Priscilla approached Hamish, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Hamish, there's something you should know. When I was driving Sheila up here, I noticed something in the boot of the Jaguar earlier this morning. I was looking for a rug because Sheila was cold, and I saw a pair of heavy gloves. They were covered in white gravel dust, but there was a dark stain on the cuff. Not oil, Hamish. It looked like rust, or dried blood." Hamish looked at Priscilla, a spark of genuine appreciation in his eyes. While Blair was busy measuring the distance between footprints and screaming at the locals, Priscilla had used her social access to see what no policeman was allowed to touch. "The gloves were in the car?" Hamish asked. "In the boot," Priscilla confirmed, "hidden under a spare tire." "Julian was killed on the gravel," Hamish mused, his mind racing. If the killer used a gaff, there would be a splashback. The gloves would be the first thing you'd want to hide. But why put them in Vane's own car? "Because," a new voice boomed from the doorway, "that's where a guilty man would hide them." DCI Blair stood there, his face a triumphant shade of purple. Anderson and Macnab, who both looked thoroughly miserable to be out in the rain again, flanked him. Blair shoved his way into the booth, nearly knocking Sheila Vane over. "Macbeth, I told you to stay clear," Blair roared. "But it doesn't matter now, we've found the motive. Bankruptcy. The wife here wanted the insurance money before the banks took the house. And as for the gloves, we found them, Macbeth. My boys did a sweep of the vehicle while you were off playing tea parties with the Colonel's daughter." He turned his sneer toward Priscilla. "And you, Miss Halberton Smythe, shouldn't be interfering in a murder investigation. It's highly irregular." "I was merely assisting Mrs. Vane," Priscilla said coolly, her chin tilted up in a way that usually made men of Blair's stature very uncomfortable. "Assist all you like," Blair grunted. "Macnab, cuff her. Not the lady, the wife. Sheila Vane, I'm arresting you for the murder of Julian Vane. You had the motive, you had the access, and we have the bloody gloves in your husband's car. It's an open and shut case, a classic Sassenach domestic." As Macnab stepped forward in handcuffs, Hamish watched the scene with a sinking feeling. He looked at Sheila Vane, who looked more exhausted than guilty, and then at the circled newspaper on the floor. Something was wrong. The bankruptcy wasn't just Julian's, it was their joint future. If Julian died, the insurance wouldn't cover a suicide, and a murder investigation would freeze their assets for years. Sheila wasn't stupid. She wouldn't kill her only meal ticket in a way that left her stranded in a Highland bothy. "Sir," Hamish said, his voice unusually loud for him, "about those gloves. Were they left-handed or right-handed? Blair froze, his hand halfway to his pocket for a cigar. What does that matter, you idiot? It matters, Hamish said, his eyes fixed on a small detail he had noticed earlier on Sheila's hand, because Mrs. Vane here is left-handed. I saw her reach for her bag with her left hand and she's wearing her watch on her right. But the strike on Julian's neck, that was a right-handed blow delivered from behind and left. A left-handed person would have struck from the other side. Blair's face turned a shade of red that suggested an imminent medical event. I don't care if she's ambidextrous. We have the evidence. Now get out of my way, Macbeth, before I arrest you for being a professional nuisance. Hamish stepped aside, his face returning to its mask of polite obedience. As they led a sobbing Sheila Vane away, he caught Priscilla's eye. She looked worried. He knew she was thinking the same thing he was. Blair had his victim, but he didn't have the killer, and the real killer was likely watching them all from the safety of the mist, laughing at the stupid policeman and his loud-mouthed boss. "Would you like me to drive you back to the station, Hamish?" Priscilla asked softly once the police cars had sped away. "No, thank you, Priscilla," Hamish said, looking up toward the ridge. "I think I'll stay here for a bit. I want to see who comes back for those sardine tins." The heavy thrum of the Land Rover's engine faded into the distance, leaving Hamish alone with the dripping eaves of the bothy and the unsettling silence of the hillside. Priscilla had looked at him with a mixture of pity and frustration before she left, clearly wanting him to do more than stand in the mud. But Hamish knew that action in Lochdubh was often less effective than stillness. He waited until he was certain the heavies were well on their way to the station to process their prize suspect. Then he turned his attention to the cabin interior. Blair had been so blinded by the presence of Sheila Vane and the convenient discovery of the gloves that he hadn't bothered to wonder why a woman of her refined, albeit prickly, nature would be hiding in a damp stone hut when she could have simply checked into the hotel. Hamish knelt by discarded sardine cans. He picked one up, turning it over in his large, calloused hands. The edges were sharp, but it wasn't the metal that interested him, it was the date stamp on the bottom. These weren't from the local grocery shop, they were part of a bulk military-style ration pack, the kind sold in outdoor supply stores in Strathbane or Inverness. He looked back at the pile of dry heather that had served as a bed. Tucked deep into the stalks was something Blair's team had missed in their rush to catch a Sassenach murderer. A small silver whistle on a cord, and a single hand-rolled cigarette butt that had been pinched out halfway, its tobacco dark and pungent. "Lugs?" Hamish said, his voice a low vibration in the small room. "Do you smell that?" The dog sniffed the air and let out a soft whine, his tail giving a single uncertain thump against the floor. It wasn't the scent of Sheila Vane's expensive perfume. It was the smell of old wool, wet dog, and a specific brand of cheap rolling tobacco that Hamish recognized instantly. It was the scent of Geordie Fisher, a man who had spent more time in the Lochdubh hills than most sheep. Geordie was a local character, a man who existed on the fringes of the law and the community, known for his skill with a rod and his absolute refusal to acknowledge any boundary or fence. If someone had been managing the estate for Vane, it wouldn't have been Geordie. Geordie didn't manage anything but his own survival. But Geordie was also a man who never stayed in one place for long, especially not a drafty bothy, unless he was hiding something, or someone. Hamish walked out of the bothy and looked down toward the manse. The silver Jaguar sat like a tomb in the driveway. Blair's bloody gloves were perfect proof, almost too perfect. They had been found in the boot, a place where a panicked wife might hide them, but also a place where someone trying to frame her would easily gain access. Vane never locked that car. He was too arrogant to believe anyone in a quaint village would dare touch his property. The realization began to itch at the back of Hamish's mind. Blair was currently at the station, likely gloating over a taped confession that wouldn't come, while the real narrative of the morning was being obscured by the DCI's incompetence. Hamish started down the hill, not toward the station, but toward the harbour. He needed to find Geordie Fisher. If Geordie had been using that boat, he hadn't been doing it for the view. As he reached the village, the rain eased into a fine mist that clung to his eyelashes. He found Geordie near the pier, ostensibly mending a net, but mostly watching the police cars with a look of intense, guarded curiosity. Geordie was a small, wiry man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that moved with the twitchy energy of a bird. "A busy day for the law, Hamish," Geordie said, not looking up from his work. "I hear they've got the woman, the English one. They say she did him in with a gaff because he wouldn't buy her a new hat." Hamish leaned against a piling, his posture relaxed and lazy. "That's what the DCI says, Geordie, and we all know the DCI is a man of great wisdom and even greater volume. But I was up at the shepherd's booth just now. I found a whistle, a silver one. I seem to remember you losing one just like it during the stalking season." Geordie's hands faltered for a fraction of a second, the shuttle of his netting needle pausing mid-air. "There are many whistles in the Highlands, Macbeth. It's a windy place. A man needs to be heard." "True enough," Hamish agreed. "But a man doesn't usually share a booth with a bankruptcy notice and a London newspaper unless he's being paid to keep an eye on a guest, or perhaps to keep a guest from seeing something he shouldn't." Geordie finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. Vane was a fool. He thought he could buy hills. He hired me to show him the boundaries, then he told me to stay in the booth and keep watch for poachers while he had his meetings. He didn't want the village seeing who was coming and going from the manse at night. He was scared, Hamish, not of the locals, but of the people he'd left behind in the south. "And the gloves, Geordie, the ones with the gravel dust and the blood?" Geordie spat into the water. "I saw a man in that car last night, not Vane and not the wife. A big fellow, moved like he knew his way around a fight. He wasn't local. He had a jacket that looked like it cost more than my boat. He was in the car for a long time, fiddling with the boot. I thought he was stealing a radio, so I stayed quiet. I didn't want any trouble with the likes of him." Hamish felt the pieces shifting. The gloves weren't a sign of Sheila's guilt. They were a planted red herring, placed there by someone who knew exactly how a man like Blair would react to such a glaring piece of evidence. The big fellow Geordie had seen was the missing link. "Did this man have a name, Geordie? Or a face you'd know again?" "He had a face like a brick wall," Geordie muttered, "and he drove a black van that smelled of diesel and bad intentions. He left before the sun was up. I thought he was just another of Vane's business friends." Hamish thanked him and turned away, his mind working through the implications. The murder wasn't a domestic dispute, and it wasn't a local grudge over a right-of-way. It was a cold, calculated removal of a man who had become a liability, disguised as a local crime of passion. Blair was about to charge Sheila Vane, and the moment he did, the real killer would be halfway to London, leaving Lochdubh to deal with the fallout. He needed to get back to the station, but not to talk to Blair. He needed to talk to the one person who had been invisible throughout the entire morning, the person who had been helping Vane with his garden, and who had been the first to point Blair toward the Jaguar. Hamish realized with a jolt of clarity that the authentic local man Sheila had mentioned hadn't been Geordie Fisher at all. He looked toward the grocery shop, where the village's newest resident, a quiet man named Miller, who had retired from the city 6 months ago to take up gardening, was calmly sweeping the steps. Miller had been very helpful to the police earlier, pointing out the best way to get the cars up the hill. He had been so helpful, in fact, that no one had noticed he was the only person in the village who hadn't been in the hotel when the sirens started. Hamish whistled for lugs, his pace quickening. The trap was already being built, but he had to make sure the right person walked into it. The mist continued to weave through the narrow streets of Lochdubh, turning the colourful cottages into ghostly silhouettes. Hamish watched Miller for a moment from the shadow of a stone archway. The man was methodical, his broom moving with a rhythmic precision that suggested a background in something far more disciplined than casual landscaping. Miller had arrived in the village with a vague story about a pension, and a desire for the quiet life, a phrase that always made Hamish suspicious. In the Highlands, people who seek out the quiet life usually have a great deal of noise in their past that they are trying to outrun. Hamish stepped out into the open, his gait slouching and his hands back in his pockets. He looked for all the world like a man who had been thoroughly defeated by his superior officer and was now merely looking for a bit of gossip to pass the time. Miller stopped sweeping as Hamish approached, leaning on his broom handle with a polite, neutral expression. His eyes, however, were as cold and watchful as a winter sea. "A busy day for you, Macbeth," Miller said, his accent a flattened, nondescript urban tone that could have come from any of the larger cities down south. "I saw the police cars taking that poor woman away. A tragic affair, a wife turning on her husband like that. I suppose the pressures of the city follow people even to a beautiful place like this." Hamish sighed, leaning against the shop's wall. "Aye, it's a sad thing, Mr. Miller. DCI Blair is very pleased with himself. He likes a quick arrest. He says the car's gloves were the final nail in the coffin, but I've been troubled by a small thing. You see, I was looking at the gravel where Mr. Vane fell. It's a very specific kind of white limestone, is it not? Imported, expensive, and very dusty. If a man were to kneel on it, or if he were to drop something in it, that fine white dust would get into every fibre of his clothes." Miller's grip on the broom didn't tighten, but Hamish noticed the man's knuckles turn a fraction whiter. "I wouldn't know. I only tended the roses. I stayed off the paths as much as possible to avoid making a mess." "That is very considerate of you," Hamish replied softly, "but here is the thing that is bothering my poor slow brain. The gloves Blair found in the Jaguar had plenty of that white dust on them. But the sleeves of the jacket Mrs. Vane was wearing when she was arrested were as clean as a whistle. She's been living in a bothy for 2 days, yet she didn't have a speck of limestone on her. Now, you, on the other hand, you've been sweeping the shop steps for an hour, but there is a very fine white residue on the heels of your boots. I noticed it when you were helping the forensics team earlier. The air between them seemed to grow heavy. The sound of the nearby waves suddenly loud in the silence. Miller didn't move. He didn't even blink. "I was at the manse yesterday, Macbeth. I told the DCI that. I was tidying the borders. It's only natural I'd have some dust on me." Of course," Hamish said, waving a hand dismissively. "But then there is the matter of the motive. Everyone thinks Julian Vane was killed for his money, or what was left of it. But I've been thinking about what he told me this morning. He was terrified of poachers, only he wasn't looking for someone stealing salmon. He was looking for someone who had followed him from London. A man who knew that Julian hadn't just lost money in a bad deal, but had actually made off with a very large sum of black money belonging to some very unpleasant people. He came to Lochdubh to hide it, and he hired an authentic local to help him secure the grounds. But he didn't hire a local, did he? He hired a man he thought he could trust from his old life, a man who knew how to use a gaff not for fishing but for professional silence. Miller let out a short, dry laugh. "You have a vivid imagination, Constable. No wonder they keep you here in the wild. You'd be a liability in a real police force." "I am a liability everywhere, Mr. Miller," Hamish agreed with a self-deprecating smile. "But I have a very good memory for faces. I spent a bit of time in Glasgow a few years back, helping with a witness protection transfer. There was a man they called the gardener, not because he liked flowers, but because he was very good at burying things so they'd never be found. He had a way of making people disappear into the landscape. You look remarkably like him, though you've aged a bit and grown a very respectable-looking beard." Miller's posture shifted. The mask of the helpful villager began to crack, revealing a jagged, dangerous edge underneath. "You're a long way from help, Macbeth. Your loud-mouthed boss is back at the station, and the rest of the village is tucked away in the hotel. It's just you, me, and a lot of wet heather." "And lugs," Hamish added, the dog letting out a low, menacing rumble from his throat. "Lugs don't like people who lie about their hobbies. You see, the motive wasn't just revenge for the stolen money. You were sent here to find where Julian hid it. You killed him because he wouldn't tell you, or perhaps because you realized he'd already spent it all on silver jaguars and rose bushes. You framed the wife to give yourself time to keep digging. You're still looking for it, aren't you? That's why you're still here, sweeping steps and pretending to be a retiree. Miller dropped the broom. It clattered against the stone, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Even if you're right, you have no proof. A bit of dust? Resemble a man in a file? Blair will laugh you off the station. He wants a wife. He has his evidence. You're just a copper who's stayed in the rain too long. You're right, Hamish said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Blair won't listen to me, but he might listen to you. If I were to tell the people who sent you that you found the money and were planning to keep it for yourself, I imagine they'd be very interested in having a little chat with their gardener. In fact, I've already sent a small anonymous tip to a certain office in London. They should be arriving by the evening ferry. It was a bluff, a wild Highland gamble. But Hamish saw the flicker of genuine panic in Miller's eyes. A man like Miller didn't fear the law. He feared the people he worked for. The quiet life was about to become very loud indeed. Hamish knew he had to push now, to set the trap before Miller decided that a second murder would be easier than a hasty retreat. He turned his back on Miller, an act of supreme, calculated vulnerability. "I'm going for my tea now, Mr. Miller. I'll be at the station in an hour to tell Blair everything. I suggest you decide where your loyalties lie before the ferry docks." As Hamish walked away, his heart was drumming against his ribs, but his step remained slow and deceptive. He could feel Miller's gaze burning into his back, a cold, lethal heat. The hidden motive had been unearthed, but now came the most dangerous part, making sure the killer followed him into the light. The trap was set, and the bait was Hamish himself. He headed toward the police station, knowing that the mist of Lochdubh was about to witness a very un-Scottish confrontation. Hamish walked with a slow, rhythmic tread that suggested a man whose only concern was his next meal. But every nerve was pulled taut like a bowstring. He didn't look at Miller. He knew that if he showed even a flicker of urgency, the professional killer would realize the bluff for what it was. Beside him, Luggs was no longer the lazy rug of a dog. He moved with a low-slung, predatory grace, his head turning occasionally to catch a scent on the damp wind. They crossed the stone bridge and headed toward the police station, but Hamish didn't go inside. Instead, he veered off toward the old wool mill, a derelict building that stood on the edge of the village, its dark windows staring out over the loch like the eyes of a blind man. It was the perfect place for a trap, isolated, filled with shadows and echoing with the sound of the rushing water outside. Hamish knew he couldn't take Miller down in the street, not with the risk of the gardener vanishing into the hills or taking a hostage. He needed Miller to come to him, driven by the cold, desperate need to silence the one man who had looked behind the curtain of his retirement. As he reached the heavy oak doors of the mill, Hamish paused. He made sure he was visible against the grey sky, then he stepped inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. "Now we wait, Luggs," Hamish whispered, the darkness of the mill wrapping around them like a wet cloak. "A man like that won't leave Lochdubh while there's a witness who knows his real name. He'll want to tidy his garden one last time." Inside the mill the air was thick with the smell of damp wool and ancient dust. Hamish moved toward the centre of the floor, where the old wooden gears of the water wheel rose up like the ribs of a shipwreck. He didn't hide. He sat down on a crate, pulled out a small battered tin, and began to roll a cigarette with agonizing slowness. He wanted the flare of the match to be a beacon. He wanted Miller to see the lazy copper sitting in the dark, seemingly unaware of the danger. The silence stretched, broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling and the distant muffled roar of the river. Then a soft scrape of leather against stone echoed from the doorway. The door creaked on its rusted hinges, admitting a sliver of grey light that was immediately eclipsed by a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette. Miller had arrived. He wasn't carrying a broom anymore. In his hand was a short, heavy length of lead piping, and his movements were no longer those of a retired gardener. He moved with the terrifying, silent efficiency of a man who had spent his life navigating the dark alleys of the city. "You're a brave man, Macbeth," Miller's voice drifted through the mill, cold and hollow, "or a very stupid one. You think a phone call to London scares me. Those people don't move that fast, but I do. I could kill you and be over the pass to Inverness before your boss even realizes you're missing from your kitchen." Hamish didn't stand up. He took a long drag of his cigarette, the tip glowing orange in the gloom. "The problem with being a gardener, Mr. Miller, is that you spend so much time looking at the ground that you forget to look at the trees. You didn't find the money at the manse, did you? That's why you were so quick to point Blair toward the wife. You wanted the police to clear the area so you could dig in peace. But Julian Vane wasn't a man who put his treasures in the ground. He was too vain for that. He wanted to see his wealth every day." Miller approached, lead pipe twitching in his hand. "Where is it, if you know? Maybe I'll make it quick for you. A Highland mercy." "It isn't in the house at all," Hamish said, his voice light and conversational. "I saw the silver Jaguar this morning. Vane was so proud of it. But did you notice the upholstery? It was custom made, he told me. Very thick, very heavy. I suspect if a man were to rip open the lining of those seats, he wouldn't find foam and springs. He'd find a great deal of high-denomination notes pressed flat and stitched into the very fabric of the car. It was his getaway vehicle and his bank vault all in one. And right now, that car is sitting in the manse driveway with only a couple of Blair's bored constables watching the front gate." The silence that followed was heavy with greed. Miller's breathing had changed. It was shallower now, the hunter distracted by the scent of the prize. "The car?" he hissed. "You're lying. You're trying to get me to go back there." "Why would I lie?" Hamish asked innocently. "I'm a dead man either way, according to you. I just thought you'd like to know that you've been sweeping around a fortune for days without even realizing it. It's the irony of it that appeals to me. A professional like you, bested by a bit of leather and some stitching." Miller paused, his predatory focus wavering. The lure of the money was a physical weight in the room. If the money was in the car, he could take the Jaguar, blast through the police line, and be gone before the alarm was raised. It was a better plan than wandering the hills on foot. Hamish saw the calculation in the man's eyes, the moment the killer's instinct was overruled by the thief's avarice. "I'll check the car," Miller said, his voice a low snarl. "And if you're lying, Macbeth, I'll come back here and I'll spend a very long time showing you what happens to people who waste my time." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Hamish replied, blowing a plume of smoke into the rafters. Miller backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving Hamish until the last moment. When he vanished back into the mist, the tension in the mill didn't dissipate. It shifted. Hamish stood up quickly, his lazy demeanor vanishing. He hadn't just set a trap for Miller, he had set a trap for the entire investigation. He knew that the silver Jaguar wasn't at the manse anymore. He had seen the tow truck from Strathbane taking it away 10 minutes before he met Miller, on Blair's orders to have it processed for forensic evidence at the central impound lot. Miller was heading for a car that wasn't there, and he was heading right into the path of the police convoy that was currently bringing Sheila Vane down to the station. If Miller tried to intercept the car or panicked when he found it gone, he would reveal himself to the one thing he couldn't intimidate, a dozen armed officers and a very angry DCI Blair. "Come on, lugs," Hamish said, his voice tight. "We need to get to the road. The gardener is about to find out that in Lochdubh the weeds sometimes fight back." He moved through the darkness of the mill with a speed that would have left Blair speechless, heading for the confrontation he had engineered with the cold precision of a Grand Master. The mist had thickened into a damp, white wool that muffled the world, but it could not drown out the sudden, violent roar of a diesel engine near the village square. Hamish Macbeth burst from the side door of the old mill, his long legs eating up the sodden ground as he sprinted toward the main road. Lugs were a blur of shaggy fur at his side, the dog's silent intensity matching his master's. Hamish knew the geography of Lochdubh better than he knew the lines on his own palm. He took a shortcut through a narrow closing between two cottages, vaulted a low peat stone wall, and emerged onto the rise overlooking the harbour just as the drama unfolded below. Miller, driven by a desperate, cold-blooded greed that had finally overridden his professional caution, had not gone to the manse. He had realized, perhaps seeing the tracks in the mud or hearing a stray comment from a villager, that the Jaguar was being moved. He had intercepted the slow-moving police tow truck at the narrowest point of the harbour road, where the stone bridge bottlenecked the traffic. The black van Miller had hidden earlier was now skewed across the road, a blunt metal barricade. In the centre of the road, the scene was chaotic. The tow truck driver, a local man named Jockey, was standing with his hands up, looking terrified. Miller was there, the lead pipe replaced by a heavy-duty handgun that looked monstrously out of place in the sleepy Highland village. He was screaming at the driver to lower the Jaguar from the bed of the truck. But Miller had miscalculated one crucial thing. The heavies were not far behind. DCI Blair's Ford Granada, followed by a prisoner transport van containing a bewildered Sheila Vane, rounded the corner from the station, their sirens beginning to wail as they encountered the blockage. "Out of the way, you lunatic!" Blair's voice boomed over his car's loudspeaker, though he remained safely behind his dashboard. "This is a police escort. Move that van or I'll have you in irons." Miller didn't move the van. He turned the gun toward Blair's car, his face a mask of frantic, cornered rage. He now realized he'd been played. There was no quiet getaway, no secret theft. He was surrounded by the very force he had tried to manipulate. He fired a single shot, not at the police but at the rear window of the Jaguar, the glass shattering in a diamond-like spray. He was trying to get to the upholstery, to the fortune Hamish had promised was hidden in the seams. "It's a lie, you fool!" Hamish's voice rang from above. He began to descend the slope, not with his usual slouch, but with a steady, purposeful stride. He didn't have his gun drawn, he rarely carried one, but he held his heavy police torch like a truncheon. "There is no money in the car, Miller. I made it up. Julian Vane died broke, and he'll take your freedom with him to the grave." Miller spun around, his eyes wild as they locked onto Hamish. "Macbeth, I'll kill you for this." "You can try," Hamish said, his voice dropping to that soft, dangerous Highland lilt. "But the whole village is watching now, and the DCI behind you is very keen to find someone besides a Sassenach woman to blame for this mess. You've shown your hand, Gardner. You've brought a gun to a village that only uses hooks." At the mention of the DCI, Blair finally found his courage, or perhaps his vanity outweighed his fear. He scrambled out of the Granada, clutching his own service weapon with trembling hands. "Miller, the gardener? Macbeth, what is the meaning of this? I've got the killer in the van." "No, sir," Hamish shouted back, still moving toward Miller. "You have a grieving widow in the van. The man with the gun is the one who put the gaff in Julian Vane's neck. He's a professional, sir, a hitman from the south. He's the one who planted the gloves in the car to make you look very efficient." Blair's face turned a shade of violet that threatened to glow in the mist. The idea that he had been played for a fool by a common criminal was more than his ego could bear. "Is that so? Framing the police, were you, trying to make a mockery of Strathbane's finest?" Blair began to stomp forward, his anger momentarily blinding him to the fact that Miller was still armed. Miller, realizing the game was truly up, didn't aim at Blair. He aimed at the one person who had dismantled his life with a few quiet words and a fake rumour. He levelled the pistol at Hamish's chest. The air seemed to freeze. In that split second, the lazy Hamish Macbeth vanished. As Miller's finger tightened on the trigger, Hamish didn't dive for cover. He whistled, a sharp, piercing note that echoed off the harbour walls. Luggs, who had been circling wide through the gorse, launched himself from the shadows of a fish crate. He wasn't a large dog, but he was a solid mass of muscle and fury when provoked. He hit Miller's gun arm with the force of a falling boulder, his teeth sinking into the thick fabric of the man's sleeve. The shot went wide, the bullet whining harmlessly into the cold waters of the loch. Miller screamed, swinging the gun wildly, but Hamish was already there. He closed the distance with a speed that left the watching villagers breathless. He didn't use a fancy maneuver, he used a straightforward, powerful tackle that sent both men crashing into the side of the tow truck. The gun clattered across the wet tarmac. Hamish pinned Miller's arms back, using his height and leverage to grind the man into the cold metal. "The thing about Highland life, Mr. Miller," Hamish panted, his face inches from the killer's, "is that we don't like people who disturb the peace, especially when they try to ruin a perfectly good afternoon of doing nothing." Blair and his officers swarmed over them then, a sea of blue wool and shouting. Anderson and McNab wrestled Miller into handcuffs, while Blair stood over them, puffing his chest out like a prize rooster. He looked at Hamish, who was standing back now, brushing the grit from his trousers and regaining his look of mild, vague exhaustion. "Well, Macbeth," Blair huffed, adjusting his tie, It seems there may have been a slight complication in the initial evidence. This man Miller, we've had our eye on him, of course. We were just waiting for him to make a move. Excellent work by my team in flushing him out." "Oh, absolutely, sir," Hamish said, his voice thick with deceptive humility. "If you hadn't brought the convoy down exactly when you did, he might have slipped away. It was a masterpiece of timing on your part, sir, truly." Blair preened. "Yes, well, one has to know how to squeeze a suspect. Sometimes you have to let them think they've won before you spring the trap. McNab, get this piece of filth into the van. And release the Varney woman. Tell her it was a routine investigative detention." Hamish watched as they hauled Miller away. The gardener looked at Hamish one last time, his eyes filled with a simmering, impotent hatred. Hamish merely nodded to him, a polite farewell from one professional to another. As the police cars began to clear the road and the villagers started to emerge from the hotel to get a better look at the excitement, Priscilla Halberton Smythe pulled her Land Rover up beside Hamish. She rolled down the window, her eyes bright with a mixture of relief and admiration. "That was quite a show, Hamish. I don't think I've ever seen you move that fast, not even when the pub is closing." "It was the dog, Priscilla," Hamish said, patting Lug's head. "Lugs did all the hard work. I was just trying to keep my coat clean." "And the money in the car?" she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. "Was it really there?" "Not a penny," Hamish admitted. "Julian Vane was as empty as a dry well. But a man like Miller, he couldn't imagine a world where someone wouldn't kill for a bit of paper. It's a very sad way to live, is it not?" Priscilla looked at him for a long moment, the mist swirling between them. "You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth. You solve the crimes everyone else misses, and then you let that dreadful man Blair take all the credit." "Credit is a heavy thing, Priscilla," Hamish replied, looking toward the distant, peaceful peaks of the mountains. "It leads to promotions, and promotions lead to cities. I think I'd much rather stay here and have a quiet cup of coffee. If I can find someone to buy me one, that is." He turned away then, whistling for his dog, as the last of the sirens faded into the Highland rain. The confrontation was over. The outsider was gone, and the dark undercurrents of Lochdubh had settled back into the deep, still waters of the loch. But Hamish knew that the peace was always temporary, and as he walked back toward his station, he was already wondering if he had enough peat left for the evening fire. The following morning the sun made a rare and apologetic appearance, casting a pale, watery light over the peaks of the Quillans, and turning the puddles on the Lochdubh quay into shimmering mirrors. Inside the police station, however, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke a goat. DCI Blair was pacing the kitchen floor, his face a vivid shade of pomegranate, while Jimmy Anderson sat at the table, methodically nursing a mug of tea and looking as though he wished he were anywhere else on God's green earth. Hamish stood by the stove, his long fingers wrapped around a fresh pot of coffee, his expression one of wide-eyed, innocent admiration. "I'm telling you, Macbeth," Blair barked, slamming a thick stack of paperwork onto the scarred wooden table. "The super is over the moon. A professional London hitman caught red-handed in a Highland backwater. It's the kind of collar that makes careers. The chief constable himself called me at 6 this morning. He wants a full report on how my strategic deployment forced the killer into the open." "And so he should, sir," Hamish said, his voice soft and deferential. It was a master stroke, bringing the widow down the road just as the gardener was losing his nerve. I don't think many officers would have had the courage to use themselves as bait like that, or the foresight to know he'd go for the Jaguar. Blair stopped pacing, his chest swelling visibly beneath his cheap nylon shirt. Yes, well, one develops an instinct for these things after years in the trenches, Macbeth. It's about psychological pressure. I knew Miller was brittle. I knew if I squeezed the wife, the real killer would panic. It's basic police work, though I don't expect a village constable to grasp the nuances of high-level tactics. Oh, I could never, sir, Hamish agreed, pouring Blair a cup of the thick, dark brew. It's a gift, surely. In fact, when the press arrives this afternoon, I'm thinking they'll be wanting to take a photograph of the man who outsmarted the gardener. You'll be a hero in Strathbane, sir, perhaps even further afield. There was talk of a promotion board meeting next month, wasn't there? Blair froze, the coffee vapour fogging his glasses. The word promotion usually acted on him like a tonic, but for Hamish it was a threat he wielded with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Hamish watched him carefully. He knew that if he took the credit for the arrest, the promotion would be his, and with it, the inevitable transfer to a desk in a grey, windowless office in a city where the air smelled of bus exhaust. To avoid that fate, he had to make sure Blair felt entirely responsible for the victory. A hero, Blair mused, a greedy light entering his small, squinting eyes. Well, I suppose it's only right. I led the charge after all, but there's the matter of your involvement, Macbeth. You were there, you tackled him. Me, sir? Hamish chuckled, a dry, self-deprecating sound. I was just stumbling about in the dark, sir. I think I tripped and fell on him, to be honest. It was Lugs who did the pinning, and then your boys moved in so fast I barely saw what happened. If I'm mentioned in the report at all, it should probably just be for failing to secure the perimeter properly. I wouldn't want to clutter up your big moment with the bumbling of a local plodder. Blair looked at Hamish, a slow, suspicious grin spreading across his face. He wasn't a smart man, but he was a cunning one, and he knew a gift when it was handed to him on a silver platter. You're a useless article, Macbeth, a total embarrassment to the uniform, but you're right about one thing. The report needs to be clean. It needs to show a clear chain of command and a decisive executive action. Exactly, sir, Hamish said, nodding fervently. I'll just sign whatever summary you've prepared. I'm sure it's much more accurate than my own confused memories of the scuffle. Right. See that you do, Blair grunted, snatching up his coat. Anderson, Macnab, get the cars ready. We're heading back to Strathbane to prepare for the press conference. And Macbeth, stay out of sight. If I see your ginger head in the background of a news shot, I'll have you directing traffic in a blizzard. I shall be as invisible as a ghost, sir, Hamish promised. As the police convoy roared out of Lochdubh, their sirens a final, fading insult to the morning quiet, Hamish stood on the doorstep and let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. The danger was over. The killer was in a cell. The widow was being cared for by Priscilla at the estate, and most importantly, Hamish was still the lowly, useless constable of Lochdubh. He turned back into the kitchen, where the scent of coffee was finally overcoming the lingering smell of Blair's cigarettes. Lugs trotted over, his tail wagging with a rhythmic thump against the fridge. Hamish reached down and scratched the dog's ears. We did it, Lugs. We're still here. No medals, no ribbons, no concrete offices. Just you, me, and a village that thinks I'm a bit of a fool. It's a beautiful thing, is it not? He sat down at the table and pulled out a small blue notebook. He didn't write about Miller or the gaff or the silver Jaguar. Instead, he made a note to check for salmon pools at dawn tomorrow. The rain had likely brought a few more fish up from the sea, and he was low on supplies. The Hogmanay stranger had left a dark mark on the village, but the Highlands had a way of absorbing tragedy, turning it into just another story to be told over a drama in the years to come. As the sun climbed higher, Hamish felt the familiar, comfortable weight of his routine returning. There would be gossip at the hotel tonight, and he would have to endure a lecture from Mrs. Kennedy about the state of his uniform. But for now, the world was exactly as it should be. He picked up his mug, leaned back in his creaking chair, and stared out at the loch. The water was calm now, the secrets of the previous day buried beneath its surface. P.C. Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he belonged, at peace in the heart of the hills. The mystery of Julian Vane was solved, not by DNA or high-tech surveillance, but by knowing that a man who plants roses in the mud always has something to hide, and that a man who shouts the loudest usually sees the least. Hamish took a sip of his coffee, closed his eyes, and listened to the silence. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. The roar of the Strathbane engines had long since vanished, replaced by the much more agreeable sound of a bubbling pot of stew on Hamish's stove. The police station was quiet once more, the air scrubbed clean of DCI Blair's bombast, and the sharp metallic tang of forensic chemicals. Hamish moved about his kitchen with the slow, purposeful grace of a man who had reclaimed his kingdom. He chopped a few carrots, surplus from Mrs. Gillespie's garden, and dropped them into the pot, the steam rising to fog his kitchen window and hide the world outside. Lugs lay stretched across the threshold, his paws twitching in a dream that likely involved chasing phantom rabbits through the gorse. It was the hour of the gloaming, that soft highland twilight where the blue of the sky deepens into a bruised purple, and the mountains seem to lean closer to the village as if to share a secret. Hamish took his bowl to the table and sat down, savouring the first bite. It was a simple life, and one he fought tooth and nail to protect. To the outsiders, he was a man who had failed to launch, a ginger-haired relic of a slower century. To the people of Lochdubh, he was a fixture, as reliable and weathered as the stone pier, and as long as they believed him to be a bit slow on the uptake, he was safe from the prying eyes of the promotion boards. The door to the station creaked open. For a moment, Hamish felt a flicker of dread that Blair had forgotten a glove or a grudge, and had returned to haunt him. But the footsteps were light and elegant, followed by the scent of expensive soap and the crisp evening air. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped into the kitchen, looking about the humble room with an expression that always hovered somewhere between affection and exasperation. She was dressed for dinner at the Colonel's house, but she sat down in the spare wooden chair, as if she had all the time in the world. "I saw the circus leaving town," she said, her voice a calm melody in the quiet room. "The village is already buzzing. Archie MacLean is telling everyone who will listen that he saw you wrestle the gunman into the harbour, though I suspect by tomorrow morning the story will involve you catching the bullet in your teeth." Hamish smiled, a slow, lazy thing. "Archie always did have a gift for the dramatic, Priscilla. I did very little but got my knees wet. It was Blair who saved the day, as he'll be telling the newspapers at 10 o'clock tonight. I'm just the man who makes the coffee and keeps the dog fed." Priscilla leaned forward, her eyes searching for him. "You're more than that, Hamish, and you know it. Sheila Vane left for London this afternoon. She asked me to thank you. She said that while everyone else was looking at her like a monster, you were the only one who looked at her like a person. She's going to sell the manse, of course. She says she can't stand the sight of white gravel any more." "I don't blame her," Hamish murmured. "It was a cold house for a cold man." Julian Vane wanted the Highlands to be a backdrop for his ego, but the hills have a way of making a man look very small if he doesn't respect them. "I hope she finds some peace in the city. It's a better place for her than here." "And you?" Priscilla asked, her tone shifting into something softer, more tentative. "Are you happy, Hamish? Staying here in this draughty station, pretending to be a fool so you don't have to grow up and take your place in the world? You have a mind that could take you anywhere. You could be a detective inspector in Edinburgh if you wanted to." Hamish looked at her, and for a fleeting second the mask of the lazy constable dropped. His eyes were sharp, filled with an ancient Highland wisdom that saw the trap of ambition for exactly what it was. "I am in my place, Priscilla. If I were in Edinburgh, I wouldn't know the name of the man who delivered the milk. and I wouldn't know which bend in the river holds the best trout. I'd be a number in a suit, chasing shadows in a place where the stars are hidden by the streetlights. Here, I know the shadows, I know the people, and when the wind blows off the loch, I can breathe. That's worth more than a fancy title and a pension." Priscilla sighed, a sound of gentle defeat. She reached out and touched his hand just for a moment before standing up. "You're an impossible man, but I suppose Lochdubh would be a much poorer place without its impossible policeman. My father wants to know if you'll be coming up for a drama on Hogmanay. He says he has a new malt he wants to test on someone with a peasant palate." "I should be honoured," Hamish said, his voice regaining its light, deceptive lilt. "Tell the Colonel I'll bring some of Mrs. Kennedy's shortbread. It's hard enough to use as a weapon, but it goes well with a good whisky." He watched her go, the tail lights of her Land Rover disappearing into the mist, and then he returned to his stew. The encounter had left a lingering warmth in the room, a reminder of the things he had and the things he chose to forego. He knew that the peace he enjoyed was a fragile thing, bought with the currency of his own reputation, but as long as the accounts remained balanced, he was satisfied. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the fire had burned down to a glow of red embers, Hamish took Lugs out for one last walk. The village was silent, the cottages dark and huddled together against the cold. The air was sharp with the scent of salt and peat smoke. He walked down to the harbour wall and looked out over the water. Somewhere out there, the truth of Julian Vane's life was still sinking, but here on the shore, the rhythms of life were already resetting. A man like Miller would spend the rest of his life behind bars, dreaming of the gardens he had buried. A man like Blair would spend his life chasing the next promotion, never realizing he was running in circles. Hamish, however, was exactly where he needed to be. He pulled his coat tighter against the chill and felt a sense of profound, quiet victory. He hadn't just solved a murder, he had preserved a way of life. He had kept the darkness at bay for another season, ensuring that the only thing the people of Lochdubh had to worry about was the weather and the gossip at the hotel. "Come on, Lugs," he whispered, the dog's tail brushing against his leg in the dark. "It's time for bed. We have a busy day tomorrow. I believe I heard a rumour that the grocery shop is getting a fresh shipment of those ginger biscuits you like, and I'll need to be there early to make sure they're up to standard." The dog let out a happy huff, and together they turned back toward the station. The Highland night was vast and indifferent, a canopy of velvet and light that stretched forever over the quiet glen. In the heart of it all, a single light flickered in the window of the Lochdubh police station, a small, steady beacon of a man who knew the value of staying still. The mystery was over, the stranger was gone, and the Highlands remained, timeless and unbowed, waiting for the next story to begin. Hamish Macbeth locked the door, blew out the lamp, and went to sleep, a man at peace with the shadows,